Okay, so we have a quorum. Thanks for joining us today. And so we're about to have our second session for this semester's Notre Dame National Security Center seminar series. My name is Alex Lin. I'm currently the Assistant Director and Senior Research Associate at NDISC. And this week we have the pleasure of inviting Dr. David Allen to give a talk about every citizen as a statesman, the dream of a democratic foreign policy in the American century. So Dr. Allen is a historian of U.S. foreign relations and a former fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. And his first book, which is, I believe, what you'll be talking about today, came out with the Harvard University Press earlier this year. And he has a PhD in history from Columbia and has held appointments at MIT and Yale. And he writes regularly for the New York Times on classical music and is currently over at the Harvard Business School. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Allen, for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Mike and everybody at, how do we say the acronym, NDISC? NDISC, there we go, for the invitation, and Sherry for taking care of the arrangements. I've always admired NDISC from afar, and I've enjoyed meeting with undergrads and graduate students today, so it's a real pleasure to be here. I will admit to some trepidation, and not only because I'm a historian among political scientists. So Bill's here, so that makes it all okay.
You managed to
Exactly. As Alex kindly said, Every Citizen, a Statesman was written mostly at the Belfer Center, so it's been exposed to this kind of audience before. But it might not at first glance really appear to be a book about international security at all. It's not a book about a specific pressing issue in international relations itself. It's not a book about whether any particular policy of the United States. It's not a book about what the national interest may or may not be. It's a book about a prior question. It's a book about who gets to decide what the national interest is. Every Citizen, a Statesman is about how Americans have tried to reconcile their power overseas with their democracy at home. It takes a question that dates back to the founding and to the writing of the Constitution, namely how foreign policy should be conducted in a democracy. And it looks at how that question was answered at a time when finding answers to it seemed to be an existential issue in US politics, from World War I to the height of the Cold War. Back then, solving the problem of a democratic foreign policy seemed to many Americans to be a matter of war and peace, life and death, world organization, or nuclear holocaust. One former State Department official wrote in 1943 that unless the problem was solved, quote, we are certain either to lose our democracy or to fail in the task of world leadership, or more probably both. But this is a problem I would venture to suggest that we barely talk about today. Even after the 2016 presidential election, when the foreign policy community went through one of its periodic realizations that something was amiss at the heart of American world leadership, the discussion that followed about how to create US foreign support for US foreign policy, was shallow, to put it charitably. Moreover, it was focused on exactly that, how to generate popular support for policies that had already been created with little to no public input. Antony Blinken titled the first speech that he gave as Secretary of State, "A Foreign Policy for the American People." Its argument was that Americans simply had to trust that diplomats would do the right thing. Having spent 6 years writing this book, I can understand the reluctance to go deeper into the problem. The question of how the United States could or should conduct its foreign policy in accordance with its democracy is an incredibly difficult one, and at times pretty baffling, to be honest. It's impossibly broad, and it raises all manner of other issues, which you're no doubt going to ask me about in the question period, which I look forward to. Let me mention just a few of them that Every Citizen, a Statesman touches on. Who should participate in a truly democratic foreign policy? What can we really expect of the American people? What, if anything at all, does a citizen need to know about foreign policy? How should they learn it? Who from? What should they do with that information? What are the responsibilities of an expert in a democracy? What are the allegiances that are owed to experts in a democracy? Can policymaking allow for public participation at all, especially in international security, where the stakes are so high? Do the answers change in a period of war as opposed to a period of peace? What if the United States is always at war? What then? This is the point at which I cop out. It is not my intention to offer any kinds of conclusions to those questions, or tell you how to create a democratic foreign policy, nor what the influence of public opinion has or has not been on United States policymaking. I'm not a political scientist. I am definitely not a political theorist or a political philosopher. I am a historian. You can also read my book optimistically or pessimistically. Lawfare very kindly gave it a review. It gave it the title, "A More Democratic Foreign Policy is Possible." The New Republic responded with "The Doomed Effort to Democratize Foreign Policy," which I quite enjoyed. One of the most astonishing things I've found in the writing of this book is that scholars far more accomplished than me have tried to answer these kinds of questions over the years, and an astounding number of them have simply given up in print. One of the things that a historian can do, though, is to whack their way through the undergrowth of the past to find the paths that were not taken in our history and try to put them back on the map. One of the arguments that every citizen of the Statesman makes is that almost no American in the first half of the 20th century, which is the main focus of the book, with the exception of some of the crustier members of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York and the State Department in Washington, wanted American foreign policy to be made in the way that it is now. In fact, as I show in some detail, many of the leading lights in US foreign policy gave their time or their money or their energy to avoid exactly the outcome we have, including from all the secretaries of state, from Cordell Hull in the 1930s to Cyrus Vance in the 1970s. And so one of the first things I want to address this afternoon is a bit of a cliche. Today, foreign policy is run by a comparatively small group of people who operate with little to no regular reference to the bulk of the citizenry. There are good reasons for that, of course, or so they would tell us. Foreign policy is a dangerous field. It's time-consuming. It requires a lot of knowledge, and there are nuclear weapons involved. You can call this class of people the foreign policy elite, or the foreign policy establishment, or the blob, whatever you want to call it. You can also discuss how open it is to debate and to new ideas, how diverse it is, how representative it is of the population on whose behalf it acts, things like that. All of these issues have been raised in the last 6 or 7 years. What is hard to deny is that the foreign policy elite exists, and nobody, in fact, does. But this is a fairly new concept. The idea that there is and should be a foreign policy elite in the United States came about near the end of the Vietnam War, as the Americans most interested in foreign policy, student protesters or the kinds of people who went to hear lectures on foreign policy and so on, came to feel that they had next to no influence on US foreign policy. The idea that there was a foreign policy establishment was the subject of pretty damning satire at the start of the 1960s, and ideally largely promoted by the John Birch Society or other far-right extremists and Marxist professors on the left. By the end of the decade, the idea that there was a US foreign policy elite was a matter of common sense. The words foreign policy elite didn't appear in the New York Times until 1971, aptly enough in an article about the internal debates the Council on Foreign Relations was then having about whether it was disconnected from the American public. Since then, the terms have stuck, and the radical critique from which they stemmed has simply been accepted and ultimately ignored. Historians then went looking for the origins of this establishment, as we like to do, which they found at the Council on Foreign Relations, and they read it onto the terms of engagement, onto the rest of US history. William Appleman Williams, the great progressive historian, wrote in the 3rd edition of The Tragedy of American Diplomacy in 1972 that US foreign policy has always been defined by an extensive elitism. He had not written anything like the same in the 2nd edition, which came out in 1962, or the 1st edition, which came out in 1959. It now seemed that this was always the way that things were supposed to be. But no. My book shows how the foreign policy community, as I call it, in search of a more neutral term, tried to create a democratic foreign policy in theory and in practice. It's about how people wrestled with what that meant and how they tried to do something about it. And it does that through the history of the Foreign Policy Association, which was the Council on Foreign Relations competitor. You may not have heard of the Foreign Policy Association, and that's quite understandable. I hadn't heard of it either until I found that it had an enormous archive no historian had ever looked at. It had never had so much of an academic article written on it before this book, let alone a monograph. And there's a reason for that. Its vision of what it meant to conduct foreign policy in a democracy lost, and it lost badly. This institution failed miserably. Everybody involved admitted it. And that, in their view, brought into question whether the United States could reasonably be called a democracy at all. But from about the 1920s to the 1940s, the FPA was without question the single most important foreign policy institution in American life outside of DC. At its peak, it counted 30,000 members, and it drew consistent support from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, the Ford Foundation in turn, support totaling millions of dollars of grants and other fellowships. Most major figures in US foreign policy were either a member of it or gave money to it. John Foster Dulles and Eleanor Roosevelt, no less, signed its Articles of Incorporation in 1928. Almost everybody who was anybody in US foreign policy supported its work to take foreign policy discussions to the people, or at least some of the people. Scholars wrote theories about public opinion and foreign policy in response to its work. It was arguably the first real foreign policy think tank in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt was seriously concerned about the approach it was taking during the Second World War and personally gave it orders to follow. And it remained important into the 1960s, when it admitted defeat in its brave but pretty fatally blinkered effort to create an interested, informed, educated public that could meaningfully participate in the making of US foreign policy. And because of its centrality in the foreign policy community, you can, I hope, tell a pretty coherent story about the two or more generations of Americans, about how, those Americans approached the issue of democracy and foreign policy through its history. Let me give you the briefest possible overview, adding that I'm happy to go deeper into this a little on. The read ahead article is one of the chapters in the book and has a bit of an overview as well about the rest of it. The FPA was born in 1918. It was the creation of Wilsonian progressives, a broad group that ran from JP Morgan bankers like Thomas W. Lamont, who would go on to become one of the leading players in US financial diplomacy in the next decade, to the leading suffragists of the time, titans in American life, women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Jane Addams, as well as many of their hugely experienced and talented lieutenants in the fight for the 19th Amendment. Building a participatory foreign policy was a task in which white, mostly wealthy women were incredibly important as organizers and attendees, a gendering that in the end had fateful consequences for the movement as a whole. The association defined its task in 1943 as taking, I quote, essential information of a non-partisan and objective character to an ever-widening public. It started off as a more progressive and even pretty provocative outfit than that, but by 1928 it had settled down. The first problem it faced was a lack of information about foreign policy, which Rousseauians felt was a crucial dilemma to solve in the deliberative world order they'd crowned with the League of Nations in 1919. So the association before World War II essentially tried to solve that problem, get more information out about foreign policy. The first thing it did, and the thing it was most famous for, was holding lunches in pretty glitzy New York hotels, high society intellectual debates among two or more people with differing points of view that became famous for their intensity and times even violence. The lunches were broadcast on the nascent radio network, and the model spread slowly across the country until the association had about 32 branches by 1945, predominantly in the Northeast and Midwest. This was the birth of the foreign policy lecture circuit, and the association essentially created it. In 1925, with the aid of John D. Rockefeller Jr., whose wife was an admirer, and the Rockefeller Foundation, it set up a research department that was intended to create objective information about the world. This was the founding era of the scientific expert on world affairs, and the association enjoyed a first mover advantage, getting the ear of the State Department, which at the time had no research facilities of its own. The association made sure to provide information to newspapers, columnists, broadcasters, professors, and so on. The theory it was working from was that public opinion trickled down being their word, from influential people to the masses, and it would provide that information. When the Great Depression struck, though, the association saw that its efforts were pretty weak in the face of fascism and communism, both ideologies that seemed to prey on the weakness of democratic culture. As a great movement for adult education swept through the country in an effort to prove democracy's critics wrong during the New Deal, the association tried to reach a broader public, setting up an education department, writing clear pamphlets filled with illustrations on the major issues of the day, starting a radio program. In 1938, the journalist Sonia Tamara wrote in the New York Herald Tribune that newspapers, the radio, and the Foreign Policy Association are responsible for having made Americans foreign-minded. Were they, though? They seemed to be during World War II, when there was an explosion of interest in the world and its affairs, which climaxed in the shockingly successful campaign to join the United Nations in 1945. We forget how successful that campaign was. 19 out of 20 Americans at the time were measured in opinion polls of knowing what the San Francisco Conference, the founding of the United Nations, was about, which is astonishing. The State Department at the time, during World War II, built a bureaucratic infrastructure that was to be dedicated, as Dean Acheson put it, to the cooperative making of foreign policy, diplomats and democracy. But nobody thought that a suitably educated public had in fact been created. The association's chief researcher, a formidable public intellectual, forgotten now, named Vera Michelle Dean, said that to say one believed in internationalism in this atmosphere was like saying one believed in the existence of the Rockettes. The association during the war found things tough. Its debate stages had become the foremost venues for discussion of foreign affairs in the land, and it carefully excised views contrary to those of the Roosevelt administration from legitimate debate from about 1940 onwards. This was important. America Firsters would receive no welcome to its stages, nor opponents in the end of the United Nations. There was, after all, a war on. But its research department was destroyed, as all its staff were drafted to fight or found employment in Washington. And suddenly newspapers, magazines, and radio shows started doing what it had always done, just at far greater scale. As policymakers built the national security state and started using what they admitted were propaganda techniques to rally the American people for the Cold War, it contemplated bankruptcy. It found a role, though, in promoting formal discussion of foreign affairs at the community level. The inspiration came from Cleveland, where the Cleveland Council on World Affairs had prospered since its founding in 1935. Its founding fathers were Newton Baker, who had been Wilson's Secretary of War during World War I. He was a huge figure in Democratic politics, and a young Republican who was the first person ever to receive a doctorate from Yale in international relations, Brooks Ameni. He was, for those of you who know your realism, the protege of Nicholas Spikeman, the forefather of geopolitics in the United States. Baker's aim before his death in 1937 was, as he put it, to create a situation in Cleveland in which every man, woman, and child in the city could learn the economic, racial, social, and political outlines of the world, and therefore create that ideal of democracy and informed public opinion. Brooks Ameni thought very differently. He thought in power political terms, and he believed that only if Americans understood the full extent of their power in the world could peace be secured. He's a remarkable figure I can tell you about more about if you'd like. The main point is he was a realist who, unlike Kennan and Morgenthau a few years later, deeply believed both in the deficiencies of public opinion and public understanding, but believed they could be overcome. I won't go through the whole history of the council, but what I do want to mention is its sheer ambition. The picture on the front of the book, I don't think you can quite see it, but the bottom half here shows a council meeting that took place in 1947 in partnership with Time Inc. There are 10,000 people listening to a speech on foreign policy in that hall at once, listening to a wide array of world leaders. By 1951, the Cleveland Council was sponsoring or running open neighborhood discussion forums where anybody could just show up and talk about foreign policy. Programs in libraries, churches, hospitals, parent-teacher associations, a speakers bureau to provide the speakers for all these events, training programs for speakers, training programs for program chairs of the Rotary clubs and Elks and so on, had its own speeches, its own seminars, closed discussion groups, and much, 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 much more. It ran 1,200 events that year, more than 3 a day, which if you talk to the executive directors of World Affairs Council now is quite a lot. Now, this Cleveland model was still very, very limited. It reached primarily a highly educated, rich, white audience, and it was entirely dependent on a level of private funding from Brooks Ameni, its co-founder, who had the good sense to marry a Rockefeller heiress, that was unusual and kept entirely secret. The model was already a touch outdated. It dated to a time when cities were crucibles of progressive reform, not a time when suburbanization was in full flow. But when Khomeini became the president of the Foreign Policy Association in 1947, spreading that model across the country was a program that drew the sponsorship of the Ford Foundation and the State Department alike. That wasn't an easy task, spreading these institutions across the country. For one thing, academic theories of democracy were changing, and the degrees of ignorance and apathy that were supposedly found in post-war opinion polls suggested to some that the people might not be educable at all. For another, the Cold War was in full swing, and as the Red Scare swept through the association and other groups, anti-communism made active physical discussion of foreign policy, physically dangerous in some parts of the country. Right-wing extremists would break up meetings and so on. Although Khomeini became president of the association in 1947, it took until about 1952 for the movement to really get going, and it didn't turn out to work very well in a lot of places. There was no real model for what a council might be. In places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, there was a focus entirely on an intellectual, political, moneyed elite for entirely different reasons in both places. In Dayton, Ohio, they used TV to promote the idea that world affairs are your affairs, this great slogan of the movement. And they reached a huge audience, but only with the slogan and nothing else. What was constant across all of these efforts, actually, there's a great opinion poll they took where they found that half of Dayton's residents knew the slogan, world affairs are your affairs, and almost none of them could say what it meant. What was constant across all these efforts was a lack of money and a limited vision of who ought to be involved in discussions about foreign policy. Great Decisions, which is the subject of the reading I sent along, was the result. That program aimed to reach a very different kind of audience beyond this kind of upper middle class white group. Well, no, it was still aimed at white people, but it completely failed to do so. And as intellectual doubts about the entire project grew into certainties, and as the practical efforts faltered, the foundations that had supported the work began to pull back. By the winter of 1968, as I detail in the last chapter, the association and the World Affairs Councils found themselves the subject of anti-war protests when Dean Rusk showed up to speak at them. They were accused of being just another tool of an establishment that they had, in fact, been founded to prevent. Why did this fail? There are any number of reasons, so much so that its failure could easily seem overdetermined, to use a favorite word of historians. The effort was racist, for one thing, and at no point sought to reach far beyond the white middle class. There was remarkably little debate at any time about how much an ordinary citizen, for want of a better term, ought to know, if anything. Did people need qualifications to be part of a democratic foreign policy? The whole effort to educate the American public might be thought flawed. Is that how you create a democracy, through education? Earlier generations of historians saw the word education in this context simply as a synonym for manipulation, which is, I think, is a pretty funny thing for professors to believe. But the progressive thinkers whose theories the association took as its example, like the association member John Dewey, saw education as a means to empowerment. That insight was fairly rare. This was a top-down effort that offered few ways for Americans to control the debate or adjust the terms of engagement. There was also, and I think this is one of the most important points, remarkably little thought put into how an educated public opinion would translate into public policy. And so the few people that the association did reach quickly became disillusioned. The State Department, as I mentioned, set up a bureaucratic structure to try to incorporate public opinion into policymaking in 1944 and 1945, but it quickly got overtaken by the Cold War, and it was pretty miserly, even at its strongest. The State Department meant little anyway, amid the coming of the national security state, the age of nuclear weapons, the militarization of US foreign policy during the Cold War. Liberal democratic thought had always found exceptions to its key tenets, freedom of discussion and so on in times of war, and so it's proved since. That's the broad story. I would usually end things there. Let me just add two specific points before I close with this particular audience in mind. As I say, I'm a historian. And so I approach the question of public opinion a little differently. One of the things that's really fascinated me in this book actually was writing the history of public opinion scholarship in political science, and especially how it interacted with the exact story I'm telling. While I was writing the book, I was incredibly fortunate to happen upon an article in an edited volume, never published an article in an edited volume, by Ernest May, the great Harvard historian, about public opinion on foreign policy. If you've read enough of the mid-century literature, Gabriel Almond and so on, the people at the Survey Research Center and so on, you can sense the exasperation they felt at trying to define what public opinion was at all, especially when they were gathering statistical evidence that seemed to them to show that traditional democratic theory, the idea that people could take in information, become reasoned, coherent citizens and so on, weren't exactly lining up with the realities of the matter. May, who wrote a lot about foreign policy and public opinion, 2 books, felt that too. He wrote in 1964 that he doubted that, and I quote, "Public opinion is an entity which can be described, dissected, and analyzed at all," adding that it was basically a necessary fiction invented to deal with a chaotic reality. He went on to say that perhaps at least some studies of it ought to begin not with what is observed, but with the observers. That's where every citizen takes off, treating public opinion as a construction that was in fact very deliberately constructed very carefully. That has a few consequences for the historical argument, but my second point for you is that political science mattered enormously in the stories I'm telling. Activists read public opinion, scholarship, Almond and others, and they worked from its conclusions, even when they disagreed with them. They were forced to by foundations. Practice also fed back into theory. If you read Almond's The American People and Foreign Policy, the classic work on the subject still in 1950, it is full of fairly snide remarks about the effort to educate the public in foreign policy. Explanations about why it was wrong, why it was silly, and alternative theories for how things ought to work. Theory on this subject, certainly at this time, did not exist in a vacuum. And I think it's important to remember that. One reviewer of my book said that it had basically no utility now, but maybe it was a message in a bottle for future generations. And I think as Almond and others' experience show, our work can sometimes, hopefully, have unexpected influence in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for the book and for your talk. And it is such a fascinating area to try and think of what we can expect from citizens to contribute to foreign policy. And as I was sort of reading and thinking about your topic, I thought of Walter Russell Mead's Special Providence book, where he says, and they're sort of tribes of people, you know, the Hamiltonians, Jeffersonians, Jacksonians, and I guess Wilsonians, yeah. And that for a large number of them, they only get roused on occasion, particularly the Jacksonians, only get roused on occasion, and they're really kicked off about something. But for the people in the Foreign Policy Association, these kinds of middle-class, educated folks, did they all lean in the same sort of direction? You mentioned, you know, they came out of the League fight. Were they all sort of internationalists? How did they handle the 30s and neutrality and so on?
Thanks, Bill. That is typically broad. What we can expect of people. There's this great, people understood that this, people in power understood that this was a problem. There's a great moment in a talk that Dean Acheson gives, I think in about 49 or 51, where he's trying to bring home to a bunch of foundational officials why he's over-egging the pudding on the Cold War, if you will. Why this is being cast as an apocalyptic struggle instead of carefully taking people through the arguments for why the Soviet Union has to be faced down. And he says, if you think about the average man in New York City, how much time does he really have to think about foreign policy? He's got to get up in the morning, he's got to go to work. When's he going to do it? He's got to brush his teeth. Can he do it then? When he's having breakfast, can he do it then? Can he do it on the subway? He's reading stuff. You know, there's no time. Dean Acheson thought that he had about 5 minutes a day to get through to people on foreign policy, which, if anything, I think was optimistic. A few years before that, he'd said it was 10 minutes. So I think he agreed with me. So this is a hugely difficult. The average member or participant at a Foreign Policy Association event was a white, very highly educated, likely moderate Republican, internationalist woman. If you went to a Foreign Policy event, the Association event, right the way through the 50s, the odds were that you were a woman and that you would be sitting next to one. this was very gendered, which makes it easy for policymakers, for male policymakers in the 1940s and 50s to cast it aside, because what do they know and so on. How they deal with the 30s and 40s is a difficult question. Before 1941, the FBA and other groups, not just exclusively them, had a policy that harks back to its heritage. If you think about the kind of time that it was founded in 1918, progressives at the time had been through a rough period during World War I. You know, there'd been a clampdown on free speech. There'd been sedition legislation. A number of them have been arrested. And so this association is born in the spirit of that, in the spirit of we have to restore free speech. And so it always had more than one speaker at an event, and they would fight intellectually. Sometimes it had 4, sometimes it had 5. And it was committed to this policy that the path to truth is pragmatism, right? Theoretical, philosophical pragmatism. The path to truth is by hearing competing ideas and weighing them. And so as late as 1939, it put a Nazi on its stage in New York, in the Astor Hotel in Times Square. And he was booed and hissed and forced off the stage, but he'd been there to start with. In 1940, 1941, that ends. The association turns in, after the fall of France, particularly. If you take its research staff, for instance, there had been a number of people who were not convinced of arguments to enter the war, who thought America should stay out as long as possible, should never get in. After the fall of France, that changes, and the whole thing moves in an internationalist direction. America First, as I say, are not invited to speak on its stages, although if you were having a debate on the merits of intervention, you would think you would put Lindbergh up against someone else. You know? And so after that, they kind of come to think that there are settled questions in American foreign policy, world leadership being one of them. And contrary views are left to one side. But I do want to emphasize, they put a Nazi on their stage in 1939. And so there was a genuine spirit of dialogue and thinking in the round about these issues.
So thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciate it. I certainly don't have access to your book, but in the read ahead, you say that the failure of great decisions shows that a more democratic foreign policy is a charade. And I'm wondering if that's enough of a case to make that argument. And what examples are there of a more democratic foreign policy? I'm thinking, you know, maybe I was thinking of the Freeze movement, 500,000 people in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure they made a difference though, so I'm not sure about that case. Maybe public opinion during the Vietnam War might be an example of the people changing and rising up, or more generally, you know, shifts in American democracy in general. Where did the MAGA right come from? Is that public or was it elite led? I don't know. But can you think of cases that would make your argument less charade-like and more positive in terms of what the influence of citizens can be on foreign policy?
It's the problem with the difficulty for a historian is there's a reason why we don't write about movements or policies that failed very often, because you're proving the negative, right? And how do you do that? The people that I am writing about had no examples of when this worked, certainly on the long term. You could point to times at which public opinion seemed to matter in the making of American foreign policy. And times when it seemed not to. I mean, they fought another league fight. We forget now that outside of the Senate, the League of Nations was incredibly popular in the United States. Hundreds of state houses up and down the country voted in favor of it. Every major voluntary association voted in favor of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it didn't pass because of irreconcilables in the Senate. But they thought that this was a uniquely American movement, because America was special. This was, you know, the positive side of American exceptionalism. Right? If America was going to lead the world, it had to do so differently. It couldn't run things in the way that Britain did. Why? I don't remember using the word charade, but it's not just me that thinks this failed. It's them. You know, in 1961, the head of the Cleveland World Affairs Council stands up and says, we know that we've not succeeded. We've come nowhere close. The person who designed Great Decision thought that democracy was Great Decisions thought that democracy was at an end. I don't know of any comparable success stories outside of any relative success stories. Sorry, outside of specific incidents like the ones you raised. But that's more kind of protest working than the kinds of constant deliberation and influence that these kinds of people were interested in. There are elements of democracy that have, of course, had an impact on foreign policy. But as a kind of regular thing, not lurching from crisis to crisis, no, I don't know of many.
Hi, David. My name is Pedro. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at NDISC. Thanks for the lecture. As someone who's interested in public opinion, this was a very interesting read. So I have two questions, and I'll try my best not to make them too poli-sci-ish. But when I was reading the piece, one thing that came to my mind was what's supposed to be the problem there in the sense of how is foreign policy special for your argument? Because any policy, all policy domains they're not democratic, right? What you have is an elite deciding which policy is going to be enacted, and then you have the population voting for them or not, or protesting or responding public opinion polls. And that's how they influence such policies. And so how come this is not an argument on how policy can be more democratic overall? Is there something special about foreign policy there? Because, for example, some political scientists argue that climate change is kind of special in the sense for democratic accountability. So I was wondering if you think that's the case for foreign policy. And is this vision of a democratic foreign policy even conceptually possible? Because I fail to see how you'd not end up with these groups that become pressure groups at the end of the day, because you're never going to have a significant portion of the population being part of these groups, right? And so is it even conceptually possible at the end of the day? And my final question, and I'm sorry, and I'll try to with this question I'll push on the spot a little bit more. Should we think of this kind of direct democracy as desirable in the current state of affairs of the US, in which we have deep distrust of political institutions by citizens? We have the rise of the do your own research movement. So is the CDC the health elite, and vaccine policies more democratic now that people are deciding for themselves that they don't want to get vaccinated? And so is this something that we should desire at all in the current state of affairs? So my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. I will reiterate, I am not a political philosopher, and writing about these people does not mean I agree with them at all. Let me take the first one. How is foreign policy special among policies? I'm trying to explain the history rather than my own views on it, okay? They thought of it as special because in their heads, there was a certain amount of democratic engagement around other policy issues, right? Whether that was true in reality or not is irrelevant. But the kinds of people who founded these groups were very experienced activists. I mean, as progressives, a lot of them had been involved in suffrage more than anything. Men and women supporting suffrage, and they'd organized around that, and they'd developed certain educational techniques that had worked in the end with the passage of the 19th Amendment. They'd had discussion groups around all kinds of progressive things, working standards, immigration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The people who thought that it was particularly important to bring democracy, a measure of public participation to foreign policy, made the argument that the stakes are higher in foreign policy because all of you can go to war and die. And at the time, certainly in the 40s and 50s, if you were paying federal tax, almost all of your taxes went to supporting the national defense. And so you had an economic stake in these discussions. That was the argument that was made at the time. Whether or not you buy it, again, is different. But I think that makes sense. Nuclear war would affect everybody, therefore everybody should get involved. And I should emphasize that these people genuinely did believe that having discussions in a town hall in Ohio could prevent nuclear war. It might seem silly, but they believed it and they acted upon it. You asked, is a democratic foreign policy on this model conceptually possible? No. These groups the founders were very invested in their neutrality and their objectivity. So they were forums for debate, not vehicles for promoting certain policies, which you can see, especially in the fight over intervention. In most cities, you've got, they founded other groups to promote intervention in World War I. So most of the founders, most of the leading lights in the Cleveland Council on Foreign Affairs went away and founded their own chapter of the Committee to Defend the Allies against the Committee to Defend the Allies by whatever it was. Defend America by aiding the Allies, thank you. Except for Brooks Amini, the founder of the council, who testified against Lend-Lease on the same day that Charles Lindbergh did in the House of Representatives. He believed that the American public was so unprepared for world leadership that it was immoral and dangerous to get involved in World War II because the American public didn't know how to deal with that yet. Jury's out on that one. And so these things were unpredictable to some extent. Is direct democracy desirable? No. Probably. I don't know. I have no strong feelings on the fact. I'll only say that by the standards of the people I write about in the book, I'm a pretty bad democratic citizen. And I think many of us would be.
I'm sorry,
No, it's all right. It's all right. They were asking people essentially to be familiar with the contents of the international section of the New York Times on a daily basis. They were, if you read the tests that pollsters gave to people, social scientists gave to people about whether they were interested in or informed about foreign policy in the late 1940s, the standards of knowledge that they were expecting for someone to be informed were preposterously high. Like, can you give me 5, like, describing in strange levels of details the internal workings of the United Nations, or like different elements of the North Atlantic Treaty, not that it existed, different elements of it. And there was no debate about this at all. It was just social scientists coming up with questions. And so direct democracy of this standard that they were expecting, and it's not direct, but it's participatory, is neither desirable nor possible. No. Especially if, and I want to reiterate this point, you don't design mechanisms to translate deliberation into policy, which was everybody's problem. Nobody designed that link, which was fatal.
To divert traffic for something, Fritz over at this asked the person a question about direct democracy, and I think you just tried to answer that just now. But I do think this final point that you mentioned, this mechanism towards policy, is really interesting. Perhaps people want to pick up on that in the audience as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Jack. I'm an undergraduate student, so I'm going to ask a very undergraduate question.
What's one of those?
I'm just noticing kind of trends in our discussion. How do you understand your role as a historian in security studies broadly versus the role of a political scientist? We have a military historian here as well, and I'm curious, how do you guys understand your roles in this field?
This is perhaps more of a political sciencey book than my advisors thought wise, right? Something I touch on in the introduction of it as the field of US foreign relations in history has transformed over the last 30, 40 years. Bill and I can talk about this until we're blue in the face. It's been reorganized basically around how certain sections of the population have engaged with US foreign policy from race, gender, class perspectives, and what impacts that has had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, the concept of public opinion itself, which is an elite concept, has dropped out of the field entirely. You will not find an article written about public opinion specifically in diplomatic history, as far as I'm aware, in the last 20 years. And so how on earth do you deal with that? We have this phrase in the field that Americans were in the world throughout their history, which they were, but American foreign policymakers always thought of them as out of it. How do you explain that? Right. That's what I'm trying to do. And so this book is kind of inching towards political science without adopting any of its methods. What my role is in security studies, I don't know, very limited, I imagine. But it seems to find an audience among historically minded political scientists. It has done at Harvard and MIT and elsewhere. Whether that's because everybody remembers reading Gabriel Almond when they were an undergraduate or a postgrad, I don't know. But if we can provide, you know, I've thought about the book mostly in terms of putting questions back on the agenda for people. I'm not trying to answer anything, really. And if we can get people in history and in political science talking about these kind of first order questions, not statistical models of what public opinion says on one tiny little issue, but the first order questions, then that I think is a good thing for everybody. That's not an answer to your question, but it was a good one.
Yeah, thank you.
Eugene, over to you.
Love to keep encouraging students.
Please.
So I'm Eugene Goltz. I'm a professor here in political science. I guess one thing is I'll start with a little bit of a comment and then try to ask a question. So you frame some of the paper and some of your conversation as seeking a democratic foreign policy in contrast to expert-made foreign policy. That's a kind of a contrast. And it's a classic, Pedro was asking you about why is this special for foreign policy? In public policy in general, expertise and democratic legitimacy or politics are both classic inputs, right? There are two ways of legitimating your policy or getting your policy implemented or adopted, or to have people who know how to build a bridge say this is how to build a bridge, and people who say we want a bridge say build us a bridge, right? You need both of those, and there are different streaks contributing, or there's a rise and fall of relative importance of expertise in politics, and at different times, right? And, in defense policy, we've had kind of a persistent trajectory among insiders towards being kind of more and more technocratic, more and more centralized, all kinds of terrible things in the making of our policy. And at the same time, you see kind of a rise in politics, pork barrel influence, for example, or the influence of ethnic lobbies, or something like that. They are kind of the opposite of this technocratic elite. And I guess I'm not sure what tree you're barking at, in the sense that, or who you're trying to pick a fight with, in the sense that, experts always have some influence, and political, whether it's public opinion or interest group politics or some representative form, always also has some influence, and they pull and tug at each other, and one dominates sometimes and the other dominates sometimes. We can pick different issues. And this is just kind of how politics and policy works. And so sometimes a deliberative democracy, a particular flavor of politics campaign doesn't work out. Why isn't that just sort of the normal ebb and flow? Like, it's sort of hard to say that, I don't know, in a historical trajectory in this same kind of era, US policy on Cuba in the 1960s wasn't somehow influenced by, kind of rabid political elements in the United States, independent of what experts thought about the importance of Cuba or vice versa. So even as deliberative democracy was failing, you still had that influence on policy. So I'm just trying to find out what's the real argument. And then I guess to try to ask a more of a question. In the older time, and hopefully you'll comment on my comment, right? That's the first thing. But then the other thing is, you talk about, so some of what you describe the FPA as aspiring to reminds me of, say, an intelligence squared debate that's offered today. That, rich elites are interested, you might listen, you take a poll of what they think about an issue first, you have some experts debate for a while, and then you take an exit poll to see, who won by how did you move the public. But there's people on both sides, supposedly, of the issues. Well, so how do we get from, that's still going on and these kind of ideals to the blob? There's actually remarkably little debate about foreign policy among the elites. How do we get to that kind of technocratic view, or that view that all right-thinking people are internationalists who believe the same thing about what the United States should do, or the relevance of aircraft carriers to what the United States should do, or whatever it might be? But, pick a country in the world, we have an interest there, and we all agree what that interest is, except for 6 people in this room. So what happened?
How did the blob
Yes,
oblobulate?
correct.
A comment on the comment. Thank you. I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody. That's well, I'm not an academic anymore. I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody. I'm trying to tell a story about what was lost, about what the vision of many people who are in powerful positions thought the making of American foreign policy should look like, and how that vision became so difficult. Right? It is not, I'm not trying to make a grand theoretical argument about anything. I'm trying to tell a story. I think it's an important story. You're welcome to disagree. Yes, the way that foreign policy has in reality been made is this debate, is this kind of ongoing back and forth between expertise and publics and so on. Yes, I agree. I also, one of the things I want to show in the book is that expertise and publics are not don't have to be pitted against one another. It's not either or. It can be both and. And in fact, in the 20s and 30s, in the kind of founding era of scientific expertise on international relations, an awful lot of people thought that experts should be fully accountable to publics. To the extent that the president of the FPA, Raymond Buell, the foremost intellectual on foreign policy at the time, went and sat in discussion groups. He would subject himself to the accountability of 12, 15 citizens after he went and gave his speech, and listened to them. Whether he acted on listening to them was another question, but at least he did it. Newton Baker, who founded the council, he was a potential Democratic nominee for the presidency throughout the 20s and 30s. He was a justice of the permanent court, justice of the Hague from 28 to 35. He taught night school in Cleveland because he believed that what the people thought mattered. And so over time, it becomes less and less relevant because of the professional incentives and all kinds of other reasons for experts to embed themselves in publics, because they don't need to with the expansion of the university and the expansion of the national security state. Many, many other reasons. There are other ways in which you can gain credibility. So we shouldn't pit these selves to them. How did the blob obobulate? That's an enormous story that would be my third book if I was going to write one. But a crucial part of it is the story I'm telling, in which it becomes less and less important over time that they make reference to the public in what they are doing. If you look at the think tanks, this is the research of Danny Bessner and others, if you look at the think tanks that are founded after World War II in a more kind of defense contracty space than the Carnegie Endowment or whatever, they explicitly legitimate themselves on the grounds that the public is not qualified to opine on foreign policy, so we will do it instead. They're explicit about that, and that carries on over time. So if there is a public for foreign policy now that's constant and so on, it's in that kind of think tanky audience, and in many other places as well. But it's there. How you end up with insularity? Well, they're all there. They're all within the same 10-block radius, you know. And it's kind of specific decisions over time that have consequences. There's no one grand story that I think you can tell. Telling that story historically would be an enormous undertaking.
Before I acknowledge Mike, I want to encourage our graduate and undergraduate fellows to jump in on the fun, and don't let Mike hog all the fun. So,
okay, thanks, Alex. So, yeah, I like the story, and I like the story because the sort of Chautauqua model that people want to really deliberate about things. There's something attractive about that. I'm also sort of like William F. Buckley. I'd rather be ruled by the first 100 people in the Boston telephone book than the Harvard Kennedy School faculty.
I can understand that.
And yeah, so the sense that something was lost is a poignant story for me. But I want to know why. It seems to me there are two possibilities. One was, like many fairy tales, it just could never work in reality. And the problem, to quote another one of my heroes, H.L. Mencken, was Buddhist Americanus was just not up to this model. So it was never going to work. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is that it was undermined by perfidious elites. And the answer to Gene's question is, how did the blob come to dominate power? They won the long march through the institutions because they cared about this, and most of the rest of us didn't. That the idea, this is what really makes the story, I think, and Pedro's point, really telegraph that, profound in the sense that it's not just an indictment of a bunch of, middle-class white people who didn't have much to do with their times except go down to the Carnegie Library, once a month and talk about things they didn't care about and nobody else really cared about. Hopefully they had good sherry afterwards. But the idea that this was, in some way, deliberative in advancing the country's policy, was just skillful. It was never going to happen. And the thing is, and I'm going to join Gene in urging some of the students to opine on this. What do people think today? I mean, I still, despite the fact that I read too much Thucydides, and I've convinced myself that I know what the answer is. What was lost was a dream that could never be true. But I don't think, well, I'm curious as to whether young people share that cynicism, or whether they think there's a way that this sort of democratic input, could be realized. What's your story, though? And then ask the students for theirs.
It doesn't have to be either or. Both of those explanations for why this failed are correct, are true. It can be. It just so happens that nobody in the historical profession had told this side of the story. We have a bunch of research on the building of the national security state, and the other side needed to be told. I don't know that their elites need to be perfidious. Many of them are, but they don't need to be. They were
By definition. Stipulate that. Fine.
I remember in talking to Ira Katznelson about it. Some of these people taught people who are still teaching now, you know, and he would always impress on that when you're writing in 1950 about nuclear weapons and democratic foreign policy, as Robert Dahl was, for instance, you're not trying to pull the hood over anybody's eyes. You're trying to grapple with the issue as best you can and find a democratic solution. So I'm trying to put faith in them as much as I can, and say that these were all responses, valid or not, to a difficult problem. The question I always get asked when I go and speak to the institutions that are in the book is, you say it failed, which it obviously did. So why are we still here? And I can't answer that, but it testifies, perhaps to bring the students in, to the power of some kind of ideal that things can be better than they are now. And I think that's what many of us feel, right? Professors in this room, people I've spoken to, and similar kind of networks and so on. There must be some better avenue for making foreign policy than we have now. I'm a skeptic that that is actually possible. The institutions, as you say, are very, very powerful and have been there a long time, and incentive structures all over the place would suggest that radical change, even incremental change, is pretty difficult. But I'm getting older, so maybe other people think differently.
Isn't it just that the students think that by being here, they'll get to join one of those institutions?
Aren't you training them to join the elite? Isn't that what NDISC does? Or are you training them to be good citizens?
We want them to join the counter elite. We want to encourage to be within the elite.
Yeah.
But Bill, what is being a good citizen mean? I mean, it really comes down again to the question about being a good citizen means, you know, you go to the Agora once a week and, you know, vote on every major issue of public policy, or, you know, you defer to your betters. That's the fundamental question.
Yeah. These are both democratic answers to, or people have defined them as democratic. What fascinated me was that Almond, his students at Princeton and Yale and so on, they all called what they were proposing in the early Cold War undemocratic. And they admitted that the progressive view was the democratic one, right? And so they would all say, what we are proposing is undemocratic, but it is the only reality that is possible to us. And that's why I adopt the term democratic foreign policy to mean the people I'm writing about, because they gave the game away. What that's worth now, I don't know, but I thought that was revealing.
Okay, Cora.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Cora. I'm an undergraduate fellow at NDISC. I'm a senior. In answer to Professor Desch's question, I'm definitely biased. I grew up mostly abroad, and I think that influenced me in terms of getting to see the impacts of American foreign policy abroad. Because if you're an American foreign policy doesn't affect you as much, obviously, because the policies for countries far, far away from you, people that are different than you. So I guess in terms of like making a generation that cares about it more would be sponsoring more study abroad programs, high school exchange programs, like putting Americans in the situations that the policy is affecting might help a little bit. I don't know, because ultimately I think it's about making Americans care more about it. Because even if you made it quote unquote more democratic and put the opportunity right in front of them, if they don't care, they're not going to do anything with it. So that would be my answer. And then my question is, I'm not sure how much you know about it, but have you looked at this phenomena in other countries, like whether like British citizens and how they look at British foreign policy, or just any other country in general? I'm curious.
Sure. that kind of promoting study abroad and so on. That has a very long history dating back to kind of 1945 and even beyond that. And I think it's difficult to prove, but I think it has had some influence. And in fact, a lot of what the institutions I've been writing about would do is they would try and bring people back from their Fulbright year abroad to speak and teach people about what they saw. And I think that was valuable, whether it moves the needle or not. Sometimes moving the needle doesn't matter. Sometimes just telling stories matters. Global comparisons. Again, it's an American story because Americans thought that this was more important than because they thought they were special, But I will say these institutions and others are working in a kind of world in which there are a lot of other people elsewhere trying to do similar things, usually organizing about specific issues, like the League of Nations, for instance. The League of Nations in many, many countries had a participatory culture around it. And even in the United States, there was a participatory culture among very, very few Americans that developed around, not the United Nations, but around UNESCO. The UNESCO had, this is not my research, but UNESCO had citizen committees or something that would, there would be meetings in communities, and they would propose questions, and they would go all the way up the chain, and that seems to have had some impact. Around the end of World War I, there was an international campaign for democratic control of foreign policy on the belief that blundering kings had led us where we were. And so that was very popular in England. The UDC at one point in 1918 had, I think, 500,000 members in England at the time. That ebbs away because essentially their only demand was that the Foreign Office be accountable to Parliament, which it wasn't before then, really. And, the United States has had the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for quite a while now. So that wasn't really, the demands were completely different. The American demand was for a transformation of the way foreign policy is done. Other examples of elsewhere were nowhere near so ambitious. I've been trying to find international comparisons even in the present day, and I have not succeeded. I mean, there are some very small experiments that have happened. I think Germany at one point has experimented with kind of citizens committees within the Foreign Office that would be consulted, picked at random and so on. But deliberative democracy and foreign policy has not had a great deal of success.
I'm actually going to be undemocratic and offer two further comments on Cora's one more question. So one observation first, and then question for you, or maybe more comments that feel free to take or disregard. So on this issue of international comparisons, so a pair of political scientists, from UCLA and Hong Kong University published this piece several years ago, just looking at the extent to which foreign publics are knowledgeable about foreign policy relative to U.S. public opinion, right? Several key insights that they offer. One, the number of IGOs identified by average U.S. citizens, 47%. Western Europe, 77%. Japan, twice as knowledgeable about these IGO businesses as Americans, right? So I think to Cora's question about international comparisons, I think there's some evidence, I don't know what to make of this evidence, but I think there's some evidence suggesting that the fact that the citizens can't be educated on foreign policy seems to be a social construction in itself, right? It doesn't need to be inevitable in that. So I think in many ways, listening to your presentation today, it makes me think that, well, I think there's probably a set of really strong and entrenched institutions, social, political, economic, et cetera, that really makes this whole notion of, well, yeah, because they can't be educated, so therefore they can't be educated, so therefore we're not going to educate them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to be the case. So to your point earlier about reviewing your book in very opposite ways, I'm going to be the more optimistic way, thinking that maybe there is a way out.
But I would say that I'm sure there is kind of comparative research now.
Yeah.
Before, I think as far as I'm aware, the first research that was done in a comparative sense, and I forget what the conclusions were, was I'm forgetting the title of the book, Almond and Berber in 1960 something. Yeah. It hadn't been done before then. And so they had no evidence to judge whether Americans were relatively apathetic or ignorant compared to other people.
Me citing these results doesn't mean that they're doing better in terms of having toward democracy.
No, not at all.
Do at all as well, but I think the fact that there is this possibility that they can become, the public can become more knowledgeable about policy.
But the kind of prior question is like, why does knowledgeability matter? I mean, everybody kind of happened upon this in the late 1940s as the measure of kind of democratic worth. But we should probably have some debate about that.
They might think about it as necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah.
Maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know either. It's just, again, it's laying the question out rather than.
See, deliberation in action.
There we go.
So Marco, you're up next.
Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Marco. I'm an undergrad here at junior year. So you ask why the FPA failed and why the stream failed. You say it was racist. This question about education, top down, etc. And at the end, you say that and our national security state was also growing pretty quickly. So can you spend some more time maybe trying to explain the historical situation behind trying to expand conversation about a democratic foreign policy within the really fast growth of the national security state and defense, specifically in the interwar and then post-war period? Is this an instance of a really good idea at the wrong time? I think I know your answer on it, but I'd love to hear more. And then if there were any conversations, or I think you would say as much if there weren't really conversations about if between the idea of a growing defense state and a democratic foreign policy, what ideas were between those happening at roughly the same time? Thanks.
I'm sorry, can you rephrase the second one?
Sure. So the national security state is growing at roughly the same time as different associations are trying to get more people involved. So what were conversations between those two ideas? Were there conversations, debates between those two? Did anybody try to reconcile them or not?
Okay, thank you, Marco. You said you think you know my answer to the first question. What do you think my answer is?
I'm going to take a guess. I think that you would say that it probably wasn't just good idea, wrong time, but yeah, I'd like to hear more.
I don't think it was a particularly good idea, but it was definitely at the wrong time at various points. Explaining the rise of the national security as a state is complicated. But things happen so quickly after 1947. And there's such a sense of urgency. Europe's shattered. Nobody's got any food. The Soviet Union seems like it's on the march. You've got to do something about it. You've got to raise inordinate sums of money to support Turkey and Greece in 1947 and so forth. And so American policymakers at the time go to extremes in the way they're describing the situation in order to generate that response. And they're like shockingly explicit about this. There's a Council on Foreign Relations study about public opinion and so on in 1949, and they very explicitly say, if we had had the educated public that we're all working for, we wouldn't have needed to talk about the Marshall Plan in the way we did, because we could have reasoned with people and they would have seen the light. But instead, we had to depict the Cold War as an apocalyptic struggle, because that was the only way of getting through to people. Marshall's speech announcing the Marshall Plan at Harvard, only parts of it are ever quoted, the bits where he describes the plan. It's a speech about public opinion. It's not a speech about foreign aid. It's a speech about public opinion. If you read the start of it and the end of it, and then the bits that he adds onto it at the end, he explains why he's speaking so starkly about the threat that's being caused about, that's coming from the collapse of Europe. And he says, I'm paraphrasing, but we need to get through to you. There is all of this information coming at you, and you need me to clarify it for you. You need me to tell you what is important and why that matters. And so he does that. And that's what everybody does. The rise of the national security state after that is an impossibly broad subject. As far as I can tell, what you end up with with the mushrooming of classification and the importance of nuclear weapons and so on, is interagency debate between various interests within the state over policy options, and then the selling of the agreement to the public, to simplify enormously. That is not what people were looking for, and I think it's especially telling that the decision is taken very, very early on, to put discussions about nuclear weapons in particular. I mean, what is more significant to global politics after 45 than the rise of nuclear weapons? It is those weapons are created in secret. The decision to use them is taken in secret. And then the Atomic Energy Commission is explicitly carved out from democracy. It's not subject to much at all. It has its own little internal procedures for debate around it. And that, I think, that model kind of spreads a little bit, or at least that's my suspicion. I don't know. But there's a lot of good research out there about the making of the national security state and so on, which I'm referencing and avoiding because it's enormous.
Hello, thank you for coming out and speaking with all of us today. We've talked a bit about the chasm between public opinion and policymakers, but I'm curious as to the effect on military. So the military is one of our most obvious and most visible levers of foreign policy. And my question is, how does this consolidation and isolation of the foreign policy elite shift the spirit of civil-military relations?
I don't know. What do you think, Kat?
I don't know either, as this is not my area of expertise, but my suspicion is that having this consolidation means that you are narrowing the field of input that you're able to get on important military decisions, whether that's from defense budget or more of an operational standpoint. So I think narrowing that diversity of thought could be a potential hazard in our foreign policy.
I would absolutely agree.
Consensus building. There we go. Harrison.
Hi, thank you. Enjoyed the read ahead and being able to talk to you at lunch. I had two questions. First, doesn't it, the story you told earlier about inviting a Nazi on stage until 1939, doesn't that kind of give away the story in a way that after 1939 they don't, which is to say that sure, free kind of democratic discussion amongst the masses is good until we reach the war, in which case some conversations are off the board. So effectively, this true democratic kind of education, facilitation of discussion is always limited in a sense. So its full realization can never come into practice. And the second thing, kind of picking up what Alex was talking about in terms of the lack of a transmission mechanism from these discussions to actually policy change, was part of that kind of, as you said, the want of those who are in charge of the association to say, oh, these other organizations, as you're talking about, will pick up kind of the policy activism, and they're going to deal with it. We don't want to deal with it, rather because lack of willingness to do it, wanting to kind of believe themselves to be a facilitator, as you're saying. Or did they ever come to the realization that, and this kind of gets to Pedro's point, that at a certain point, even if you start advocating for policy, you reach a bottleneck with all the other domestic politics matters. And you're competing for them. As you said, there's only like 5 minutes in a day in which someone can agree with foreign policy. Well, then there's 5 minutes for discussing other constitutional amendments, other things that are matter to domestic politics. So effectively, you're now in competition with all matters of American politics, and not only time, but also the need to vote on specific issues of choosing between candidates. I was curious if they ever considered that as a potential problem.
Thank you. Those are great questions. Just to be clear, the kind of lack of mechanism. This intellectual historian Andrew Jewett's written a brilliant book about progressive thinkers, Deweyans, and so on, and their influence on political culture and various things. So just you kind of take a look at that. But he suggests that this wasn't a problem limited to foreign policy. Progressives of all kinds thought, because they believed that the state was part of the public, you didn't need to connect the two in like formal institutions, because some kind of alchemy would happen that would connect the two, right? That if the state is part of the public and the public is stating, then the state is listening. Doesn't the decision in 1939, 1940, 41 give away the store? Yes, it does. As soon as power gets involved and the prerogatives of the state start to matter more, yes, you start limiting the discussion. I don't think they did it for nefarious reasons. They were patriots. They wanted to, support the war effort and so on. What happens after that is more challenging. They were all internationalists. They all believed in the League of Nations. Of course, they believed in the United Nations, even though it was a very, very different institution. And they took their opportunity to promote that afterwards. To come back to the UNESCO example, for instance, there are kind of, even in theory, in State Department institutions and so on, there are kind of varying degrees to which they're willing to accept more participatory structures depending on the policy area. Hardcore US foreign policy, no interest in listening to the public through like formal institutions. The United Nations, well, a little bit more, because the United Nations, what does that really do? UNESCO, irrelevant, let the people have at it. And so you can redirect, you find a lot of the people who were debating intervention and isolationism in 1941 moving into kind of UNESCO policy committees on cultural exchanges and so on in the 1950s and 1940s, or they move into kind of people-to-people exchanges. And why talk about foreign policy when you can answer a letter from a child in Japan? This kind of thing. And so the energies get diverted. What was the second question again?
Oh, it's just about the transmission mechanism, going a little bit more into detail on us to. One, if they saw, and I think you kind of already answered this, if they saw competition with other domestic policies as something that's going to seriously hinder their ability to engage with policymakers. And then the second part was, did they see, kind of in your anecdote about how there were spiral off organizations from this? If they saw like them as that's the role, they're going to be the activists and the people who get more engaged in policies, but that's not necessarily what we want to spend our resources and time dealing with.
Yeah, I don't think they were explicitly thinking that they were competing for time against like economic issues or anything like that. They imagined that everybody's just available to go to discussions in perpetuity. They were all very rich. They didn't have a lot to do. This was also the time of the 6-day week, so everybody was supposed to go to lectures after they've been to work on a Saturday. I don't really understand. So I don't think they thought they were competing in that way. The mechanism stuff is bizarrely, they hated pressure groups, right? Because what is what are lobbyists? What are pressure groups? They're not. That's not deliberation. That's a different kind of thing. And so they have this weird mental block of, if you take the 39 to 41 period, when there is a genuine national debate over the future of US foreign policy, stoked very carefully by Roosevelt, and the deck is stacked. And they hate this. They hate it when all of the people get involved in foreign policy, because it's uneducated blather, and everybody's speaking past one another, and everything's out of control. And they're looking forward to the time when everything is calmer and they can have rational discussions. And at that point, you just got to throw your hands up and think, what was really going on? Again, it's not clear like what the end game is.
Okay, Sebastian, we're going to go over to you.
All right. Hi, I'm Sebastian Whitaker. I'm an undergraduate fellow here at NDISC. And so my question, kind of a comment, but going back to what we discussed earlier, we were talking about how Americans are undereducated about world affairs compared to people from other countries. And I was wondering if possibly one of the reasons of that could be the complacency of being in control the way America is of itself. And I'll kind of clarify that a little better. Say, for example, that Belgium were to make a doctrine where they said that if Mexico invaded the United States, they wouldn't help us. I don't think anyone in America would care. But reverse that and say America says a doctrine that says that if China invades Taiwan, we won't do anything about it. That would have massive implications for the whole world. But when other countries if another country were to do something similar towards America, it have basically no impact on us or no direct impact on us. And so I was wondering if maybe that's one reason why Americans don't care as much about foreign policy relative to things that actually do impact them, which the things that impact Americans come from within America for the most part.
Sure.
We have 2 minutes left, so let me sort of acknowledge and apologize to Fritz, who has one question on the board. Does the author have a sense of major increase in American public contacting their representatives in Congress on foreign policy matters? If citizens believe they could take the attention or get the attention of members of Congress, did they really care about foreign policy organizations? So with 1 minute, you can pick which question to pick on, and we'll let you close it.
They couldn't get the attention of members of Congress. To answer that question, that's Henry Kissinger's argument, right? The American people don't need to care about. Kissinger's weird in many respects. He's like involved in a lot of these elements. He likes the fame, so he like appears on a lot of the programs and so on as a way to get influence. Put that aside. This is Henry Kissinger's argument that Americans aren't actually involved in world affairs because nobody's trying to invade them. And therefore they don't need to care, and that's understandable. And we're gonna run the world for them. I think that's broadly true. One of the stories of the book is constantly trying to find arguments that will work with the public for why foreign policy matters to them. That's why world affairs are your affairs was not the initial slogan of the movement. It was foreign affairs are your affairs, but they jettisoned that because if foreign affairs are your affairs, then it sounds foreign. It sounds like something that we don't have anything to do with, but we're part of the world, so therefore it should be world affairs or world affairs, your affairs and so on. Yes, I totally buy that. And that's an argument that gets made, especially in justifications for why you don't need to get the public involved, because what does it matter? Whether I buy that's another matter, but yes, that's definitely an argument.
Okay, on that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Ellen.